No designer could close the deal. The boardroom had said it out loud. No one in the room could give them what they wanted. The contract rested on the long table like a sleeping giant, its pages promising factories, exports, and the revival of an entire region's textile economy. Cameras were off, but you could feel the pressure in the air. Polished shoes scuffing, the automatic coffee machine breathing like a reluctant beast, and a circle of men in suits looking at each other for answers that did not exist. Then a woman with thread on her fingertips and a child's backpack slung over her shoulder walked in, and everything changed. Her name was Lin Xiulan. She smelled faintly of starch and dye, the subtle perfume of long days and long nights threaded into the fabric of her skin. She had no pedigree, no glossy portfolio, no economist's forecast or marketing slide to back her claim. What she had were hands that had turned scraps into gowns, into pieces that made people stop and ask where the story came from. Tonight, those hands were raw, and her shoes had seen better markets, but her eyes were steady. This is not the end. It is the moment when the crowd holds its breath and waits for an impossible thing to happen. It is the moment before a stitch becomes a verdict. She had not always been invisible. Once, in a small apartment over a stall market, laughter threaded through the rooms. Children ate soup that was too thin but warm. There had been a husband with shoulders broad enough to carry all of them, and a steady paycheck that made rent possible. There had been a life that, on paper, looked ordinary and safe, but ordinary unravels in a season. One argument about money, a misunderstanding stretched by pride, and then a rumor like a moth in the night. Same fabric, different tear, papers signed at a kitchen table, and a name crossed out not because of a crime but because of a decision. The decision to leave a marriage she had wanted to save. The details were ordinary and sharp. The aftermath was public. Neighbors she had once shared dumplings with took sides as if they were referees in a fight. Someone whispered about her being careless with money. Someone else suggested she did not belong to the circles that mattered. Li Xiulan, her former sister-in-law, turned rumor into accusation on purpose. There were cold looks at the market, invitations that stopped coming, and a notice pinned to the factory bulletin board. Temporary suspension pending review. The factory's doors did not slam shut with a dramatic sound. They simply, one by one, stopped opening for her. Her children Fei young, wide-eyed, and 9, Yunwo small, with a laugh that used to slip past shame and make a room lighter, felt the change. In the way their mother tucked in their shirts at night, and in the way she smoothed the thin patch on their school bag. They learned to hush their questions. Hunger makes a child practical. Fei Yang learned to set an extra place at the table anyway, just in case there was a paternity test. That phrase holds weight, and then loses it. For Lin, it was another way the community examined her seams. She sat at a plastic table under a neon sign in a clinic that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee and watched technicians move in the small, quiet business of evidence. The result never fixed anything the way she needed it to. It simply became a postcard she could not mail back to the people whose opinions had hardened. The test cleared facts, but facts did not always stitch a reputation back together. Workplaces are strange places. They are temples of productivity, and also marketplaces for gossip. Lin learned this the hard way, at the factory where she had worked since, before her marriage began to splinter. Someone rearranged the ledger. A supervisor misfiled her hours. A small shipment went missing, and the finger pointed at her, because it was easier than admitting negligence. The management, under pressure from local cliques, and fearful of scandal that might scare away buyers, decided to suspend her. They called it policy. Lin called it a closed door. That closed door pressed against everything: bills, child care, the kindness of friends, which felt like a currency that could run out. The nights became long. Lin collected fabric scraps, like other people collected memories, ephemeral, small, but never entirely useless. She hid them in the bottom of the laundry basket, tied them into squares, stitched them into little pouches that smelled faintly of soap and the night market. From those slips of cloth she began to make something that wasn't just repaired clothing. She started to make statements. Her earliest pieces were small and ragged in the way hope often is in Evan hymns. Mismatched buttons, colors that had bled together and found a new harmony. She worked by the last bulb of light, with the radio playing songs that reminded her of other hands in the world. She taught herself to reinforce seams with an economy stitch that used half the thread of a standard seam, and held twice as long. She learned to fold, not cut, to let pattern emerge from the tactical need to save fabric. She discovered that the decorative stitch she used to hide a patch made the patch into an ornament if placed with intention. Scarcity taught her aesthetics. At first, these garments were for Fei-Yang and Yun. She refashioned an old jacket into a jacket that made Fei-Yang stand straighter. She braided scraps together to make Yunlu a belt that made his trousers look proud. A neighbor saw the brother and sister on their way to school and asked where the children had bought such fine-looking things. Word spread in the market, because market people are old storytellers at heart. Word spread because the garments looked like they had a patience and wisdom in their stitches. There is a craft that exists between hands and eyes, technique that becomes language. Lin learned threads of that language and started to speak in quiet confidence. When she repaired the factory manager's son's jacket free of charge, she did not expect to be noticed. But Director Chun noticed. He had been in the business long enough to know when an artisan's hands were fluent. He found Lin one afternoon at the back of the market, pounding out a hem with a small, heavy thimble. He did not bring authority with him, like a judge. He carried a practicality that smells of oil and steam, like machines and midnight shifts. "You're mending like you're building a house," he said, watching the neat, economical stitches. Loop and double. There was no charity in his voice, just recognition. "Do you have time to come by the factory? We have a program short-term work. Prototype runs. It's not glamorous, but it pays. And sometimes, people get to show what they do." She almost said, no pride and suspicion braided together in her throat. How many offers had come with the small requirement of smiling at the right moment? How many traps lay in waiting rooms, with minted pamphlets? But Director Chun had hands that told truths too. He carried no airs. He had the same calluses on his index finger, the same cheap metal ruler folded into his back pocket. When he added, "We need someone who understands how to save a bolt without losing the beauty," Lin felt something open that had been shut for a long time. At the factory, the hum of machines is a language all its own. Gearing teeth click like the metronome of labor. The floor smells of warmed fabric and industrial oil. There are rules, time cards, quotas, and a nervous etiquette. Lin arrived with a small portfolio of patched garments, no glossy shots. Only the truth of things made by hand. She began at the bottom, threading machines that had been designed for speed, teaching herself to balance precision and the kind of saving that did not look cheap. When seen from a stage, she moved like someone learning to breathe again, slow at first, and then with increasing ease. Director Chun put her on a prototype line, and she learned to scale her thrift. The economy stitch that had been perfect for mending could, with adjustment, become a reinforcement for seams. In garments meant to endure export and machine wash, she figured out a lay method that reduced waste by staggering pattern repeats based on small differences in dye lots. The ledger of waste began to look different. Less thread, less margin for error, more finished pieces with story in the seams. At night, when she folded the prototype pieces into a battered suitcase, she thought of Fei-Yang and Yun. She thought of the quiet dignity she wanted to keep for them. She had not yet imagined a competition. That idea would come later, first as a whisper in Director Chun's office, then as a small step onto a stage. Competition, in the regional circuit, is both theater and street market. Judges are people who have seen many forms of beauty, and are dangerous with their opinions. The audience is hungry for spectacle. The booths smell of glue and cheap perfume, and something pricier. Possibility. On a day with a thin sun, Lin walked into a hall that had banners in multiple languages, and a crowd that felt like the world compressed into a square of parquet flooring. She carried a bag of things she had made. A child's jacket patched with geometric scraps, that, to a stranger's eye, looked like an intentional collage. A women's blouse cut with surprising flair from an unwanted bolt. A scarf woven from tugged threads that clung to the air like a promise. Lin Xiulan was there too. Her smile, a razor that had always been sharp against Lin. She moved through the crowd, like a woman with allies, her own pieces glossy and magazine-light, her dress a careful statement of taste and connections. Around her hovered a small group of people who whispered in the kind of voice that signals the ability to ruin someone's day. She had reasons to keep pressing Lin down. The market had no loyalty beyond advantage. Sabotage is a quiet, slow work. At the provincial competition, someone switched tags, mislabeling colors, replacing care instructions with misleading notes. A seamstress from another stall cut a belt wrong, leaving a thread that could unravel in 100 washes. Judges frowned. Lin's pieces arrived late to the judging table, a fact that in the petty economy of panels made them appear careless. She thought of walking away. It would have been the small, sensible action, to retreat with grace, and pretend that dignity was worth the cost of silence. Instead, she stayed. She stood in a narrow corridor backstage, where the smell of starch hung thick, and listened to the murmur of cloth. Her hands folded patterns in the air, as if tracing solutions. The small acts she had practiced reinforcing, folding, economizing and spooled into decisive moves. She retied a belt with a hidden knot that would redistribute tension. She replaced a miscut sleeve with a sleeve from a second experiment that fit in by color and intent. When the judges came through, they found garments that looked like accidents of genius, rather than salvage operations. One judge, a woman with silver hair, and a reputation for seeing what other people missed, smiled in a way that felt like apology for all the hard things Lin had endured. They called her name. The applause was cautious at first, then sincere. Lin Xiulan's face changed from smug to consternation. The factory chorus women who had watched Lin stitch their neighbors' coats, who had once shrugged at her misfortune, clapped loudly now. For the first time in months, a door opened, not because someone behind it had pity, but because a public had judged by craft and beauty, not by rumor. That victory was not a coronation. It was a light that showed another path. Director Chun, who had sat stiffly in the third row, nodded, and then found his way to her. "You did not just fix things," he said. "You made them sing." But the market is also a map to larger dangers. And, sometimes, to larger stages. Within weeks of her regional win, Lin began to receive invitations. Some were small. A commission to mend a boutique sample. A chance to teach a night class to apprentices. But one invitation felt like an entirely different world. A consortium of buyers and cultural exporters groups from the coastal cities and overseas were putting together a strategic partnership. They would select one designer or a small group to produce an exclusive line meant to be both authentic and scalable. The brief read like a riddle. Resonant cultural identity, sustainable sourcing, replicable production across small workshops, marketable narrative for international consumers. In other words, they wanted the story in the stitch, but also the math in the margins. The language in the brief was careful. Multi-year licensing, distribution across continents, local job creation, tied to measurable outcomes, a projected economic impact that, when read in the exaggerating glow of trade press, could be described as transformative enough to make people call it a trillion-dollar opportunity in headlines and in pitches. The consortium hired people who spoke fluent spreadsheets, and even more fluent fear. Everyone wanted the lift this partnership promised. Everyone wanted to be first in line. Designers and glossy portfolios circled the opportunity like eagles. They came with pedigrees, and glossy renderings, and consultants, who could spin a press packet in an afternoon. The first rounds of meetings felt like theater. Presentations that resembled architecture more than clothing. Models that wore pieces described in 3 different languages. And one universally understood gesture to much prestige, to little truth. The buyers grew impatient. They had asked for authenticity and scalability. What they were getting was an industry's attempt to package authenticity. When the consortium's committee met in a high-rise boardroom, with windows that swallowed the river, tensions rose. The team from the consortium said they needed someone who could make the line with local workshops, and who could, importantly, reduce waste and lower production costs, without diluting the story. "We can't sell nostalgia without responsibility," said Chairman Yan, an elegant, measured man, who read risk for a living. "We need a partner who understands the factories, who knows the thresholds on the shop floor." Mr. Pierre, a visiting consultant, with a taste for the theatrical, leaned forward and tapped a slide that showed potential market uptake like a rising graph. One by one, the established names presented. They came with big promises and small plans for implementation. They brought samples that looked like museum pieces, but required equipment that small workshops did not have. They proposed machinery, investments, and digital design houses, but one can only fit so much heritage into a machine's template. The committee's excitement shifted toward frustration. The proposal that most impressed them on paper turned out to be the least feasible to scale in places where labor is not a cost to be erased, but a community to be preserved. Someone at the table murmured a phrase that tasted like doom for the region. "None of the designers can close this." The manufacturing partners wanted assurances, the buyers wanted brand stories that would travel, the financiers wanted predictable margins. The deal wavered. Meanwhile, in a market far removed from high-rises and polished shoes, Lin taught a small class at night, 2 women who had never been asked to cut their own piece, but had mended other people's lives all their adult lives. She taught them to match grain lines, to place a seam not to hide a mistake but to make it essential. She spoke about stitches that save thread without sacrificing strength. Her students watched her fingers make magic out of the economy of scraps. They learned, and with learning, came a small currency of pride. When Director Chun told her about the consortium, he did it with the bluntness of a man who had watched too many deals unravel at the edge. "They're asking for the thing you do without thinking," he said. "They need someone who understands how to make a story that can be built the way local workshops actually build things. But listen, these rooms are full of people who can smell a story from a slate floor away. They'll want the polished versions of what you do." Lin thought about saying no. Her life had been shaped by refusals. The market's refusals. The factory's refusals. The family's refusals. She had not yet learned how to refuse a chance to change the children's lives. She thought of Fei Yang waking up, rubbing his eyes, asking if today would be different. She thought of Yun Luo, making an earnest offer to share his soup. And she thought of the hands that stitched hope, which wanted to be seen not as a charity case, but as a collaborator. So she sent a sample one of the pieces she had used in the regional show, reinforced now with a technical seam she had adjusted to machinery requirements. She wrote a note that was plain. "I can teach small shops to make these. The stitch saves material and time. The patterns are made to accommodate die lots. The story is of place and people. If you want authenticity, make it pay for the people who bring it to life." Weeks passed. Email threads grew and cooled. The consortium's committee sent messages through layers of assistance. It's a familiar choreography. Attention blooms, then narrows into the formalities of due diligence. Meanwhile, the market didn't stop. Li Chunfang's group posted photos of new partnerships, smiling faces, and swallowed victories. Rumors surfaced that gave the committee pause, that a local conflict had legal vibrations, that a supplier might be unreliable. The consortium became cautious, the kind of caution that lives on the edge of bureaucracy, smells like 1,000 tiny doors closing. In one meeting, the consortium's procurement manager, said the only way forward was to test in small pilot runs, and to pair a known designer with community-based workshops. He insisted on someone with visibility and a track record. The room fell quiet. They were looking at resumes that glittered, but none of those papers had Lin's fingerprints. The day an official invitation arrived, Lin was elbow-deep in threads at a public sewing table in the market. It had been a morning filled with patching school uniforms, and her hands still bore blue dye in their creases. The courier handed her a glossy envelope. Inside, the invitation read, "A preliminary meeting to discuss inclusion in the consortium's pilot program." The language was cautious, conditional. The opportunity felt, to her, like a heavy button sewn with both hope and risk. That night, before she told the children, she sat on the floor and arranged her samples on the blanket, like a small constellation. She thought about how much was at stake, not only contracts and money, but the dignity of people whose labor had been invisible. She thought of the way Li Xiulan had tried to discredit her, the way the community had whispered about her choices, and the way, now, one invitation could set a new pattern. Zhejiang and Junluo slept in the next room, their breaths steady, a lullaby carried into dreams. Lin pressed her hands to the fabric, as if sealing a small prayer into the seams. She did not imagine herself as a savior. She imagined herself as a maker who wanted the work of making to count. If this story is speaking to you, stay with it. There are moments ahead that are equal parts invention and risk, and the next beat comes from the way courage meets opportunity. The preliminary meeting was scheduled in a glass building that looked out over cranes and rivers. Lin arrived early, not with a glossy portfolio but with a suitcase of garments that had lived in her house. She felt the look of the receptionist's neutral appraisal, and the slight tilt of heads when she took the elevator with executives whose shoes might have cost more than her month's rent. When she opened her suitcase on a table in a conference room that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and new money, the fabrics on her lap made a small, stubborn sound, cloth resettling itself under judgment. Presentations in such rooms move like drills. People speak in charts and probabilities. Lin watched as men and women discussed supply chains, tariffs, and consumer sentiment. A consultant from overseas, Mr. Pierce, spoke with an accent that admired both heritage and profit. He used words like scalability and authenticity as if they were equivalents. Chairman Yan nodded. The legal team made notes. Lin waited for a gap where she could tell them how to hold the thing they desired, the culture, the story, without breaking the people who made it. When the floor parted for questions, she did not fumble. She stood and spoke from the center of small things, rather than large syllables. Authenticity, she said, is not a label you hang on a factory. It is the memory in the hands that makes the seam. If you want the story to travel without losing the people who tell it, you must design the work to the realities of those hands. That single, simple sentence did not please everyone. Some people in the room wanted a soundbite and a number. Some wanted a consultant with a glossy slide deck. But Director Chun's presence, seated at the back, felt like gravity. He had vouched for her. He had sat through community meetings, and saw in Lin the bridge the committee described, needing. Afterwards, there were more meetings, and the decisions were the slow sort that could hold a person in suspense for weeks. Through it all, Li Chunfeng's influence vibrated like a low, persistent note. There were calls from people who used to be friends, offers that smelled generous, but were strings in disguise. There were nights when Lin thought of quitting. There were other nights when she thought of threads, and of how one judicious stitch could redirect the tensile force. Before the consortium could make a substantive decision, the regional competition circuit advanced to a national showcase stage. Consortium's committee used as one of their scouting grounds. It was the next step on a ladder that led either to recognition or to more whispers. Lin was invited to present. The invitation was, too many eyes, a validation, to Li Xiulan. It was a threat. Backstage at the national showcase, the air tasted like adrenaline and sizing spray. models adjusted hems, and judges took notes. Lin's hands trembled only once when she unzipped her suitcase, and saw that every piece had to look whole under a light that could find flaws. She adjusted hems, tamped seams with the pinking shears her grandmother had once used, and felt the room's energy fold around her like a cumbersome gown. Senior judge examined her work, and frowned once on old habit of professionals who had seen improvisation passed off as craft. Then she leaned closer, the way people do when they find a secret. "Where did you learn this?" the judge asked. Lin answered simply, telling of nights, of Feiyang and Yunluo, of the factory, of Director Chun, of how a stitch could reduce thread use by nearly 30% when placed at the correct angle. It wasn't a boast. It was a mechanic. Out in the hall, Li Chunfeng made a show of congratulating other designers, her eyes occasionally slashing toward Lin, as if trying to sew up her confidence. Someone nudged Lin, and whispered that the opposition had called in favors. A judge who owed a debt had been persuaded to vote differently. A spotlight that had been promised flickered at the last minute. The backstage murmurs mapped a network of pressure that was not always visible on the floor. These were the little manipulations that make competitions feel muddy. Nevertheless, when Lin's name was called, the room responded like a wave breaking on rock. Surprise, followed by applause that grew steady and warm. Her work did not merely cover bodies. It shifted them. People leaned forward. Cameras caught angles that had not been choreographed. News feeds later described the garments as unassuming and thrilling, an awkward but beautiful phrase that fit the way her pieces had quietly occupied the room. Her victory at the national stage brought new attention. It also brought new risks. With recognition came scrutiny. With acclaim came people who wanted to extract value without contribution. Invitations turned into bargaining, and bargaining into formal offers, and formal obstacles. Agreements whispered in corridors, and then written in cold clauses. Some offered her good money. Some wanted rights she would never surrender. One letter from the consortium asked her to join a negotiation table in the city. The negotiation was scaled and serious. External buyers, local manufacturers, and potential financiers all at one table that could make or break small workshops. The language changed from design to deal. The headlines that would later call it a trillion-dollar vision had already started to appear in the minds of ambitious men who loved big numbers. The room that would host the negotiation was sterile and tall, the way some places are made to intimidate. At home that evening, Lin packed samples carefully. Feiyang watched and copied, folding a scarf with reverence. Yunluo asked if she would bring home a trophy. Lin laughed, careful to make it matter less than the work. She did not know how the negotiation would turn, only that she must go, and she must show not only what beauty could be but how that beauty could feed people for generations. She sealed the suitcase and felt, in the weight of the fabric, the weight of what she carried. Outside her window, the market lights blinked on like a stadium of small fires. Community lives continued in their modest arc shops opening. An old man sweeping. Children returning with small winnings. For a woman who had been pushed to the margins, the invitation to a negotiation table was both an honor and a test. It would require more than needles and judicious hems. It would ask her to translate the language of craft into the language of contracts. When she arrived at the negotiation, the room smelled like new paper. People spoke about supply chains and forecasted demand, with the calm cadence of professionals who had rehearsed their certainty. Lin opened her suitcase and laid her samples like a map of a life. She spoke in practical terms, how a particular seam she used cut waste, how the patchwork could be standardized into pattern blocks for small workshops, how local dye lots might be marketed as unique rather than problematic. There were skeptics who wanted proof numbers, charts, projections. Lin handed them what she could. A list of small workshops she knew, the times she'd reduced waste, the price points that would make the line competitive. She told them she would not sign away the rights of the artisans who made the work. It was a strange stance in that room, where rights are often footnotes and contracts, swallow small makers whole. But Lin's voice carried an authenticity that was non-negotiable. And then, as the negotiation seemed to find a rhythm, a whisper crawled into the room. Someone in an adjacent table had raised an objection that brought the conversation up short. The buyers grew cautious. The legal team dug in. The committee turned over the idea like a complex seam. A model of risk lay across the table. Had someone set this up to fail? Was there enough evidence that the model could scale without swallowing the people who sustained it? The talk of pilot runs began to sound like a way to delay. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, the contract remained a sleeping giant, and the room hummed with the sound of people trying to make certainty out of texture. Lin sat with her hands folded, the small scars on her thumb telling stories she did not have to explain. She watched the faces of men and women who weighed livelihoods like coin. She could feel the deal tilting, not from absence of will but from absence of a convincing, live demonstration that connected heart with mechanization. That is, when the moment appeared for her, the moment when a stitch could become a verdict. The room needed something more than bullet points. It needed a living proof. A demonstration that showed how her technique could be replicated, how the workshop could make consistent pieces without losing meaning. It needed someone to bridge two languages, the language of craft and the language of scale. Lin could have waited for the committee to organize a pilot. She could have let other people make the first move, to test her methods, and then take the credit. But there are times when waiting looks like consent to erasure. There are times when the only way to be seen is to step into the center of a stage that is not built for you, and to speak in the vocabulary of things made with hands. She rose. The room turned. For a second, a silence, like a held breath, settled over polished wood. No one had expected her to volunteer for that role. Men in suits shifted their papers, as if to rearrange the world into a more comfortable shape. Chairman Yan looked over his glasses. Mr. Pierre folded his hands, his face a mask of professional curiosity. Lin did not have a prefab demonstration. What she had were three things: a prototype with a technical seam that saved thread, a network of small workshops, ready to be trained, and a story that connected the garments to the people who made them. She asked for permission to show, and in the way of polite rooms, it was given. She began not with numbers, but with the sound of a spool unwinding. She threaded a needle with hands that had thread in their DNA. She showed how a single stitch, placed precisely, shifted how a seam bore tension and cut material use. She demonstrated how a lay could be altered to minimize offcuts by alternating pattern mirrors. She showed how dye lots, instead of being a production headache, could become a selling point, each piece slightly different, a marker of place and practice. She told them what a garment would mean to a buyer who wanted authenticity. Not an artifact, not a museum piece, but a living product, made by hands that could be proud. The room leaned in. People who had argued in spreadsheets found themselves watching cloth being folded like a negotiation between necessity and beauty. There was no theatrical flourish, just the blunt honesty of a demonstration that bridged two worlds. Lin's hands moved quickly, and with a kind of economy that looked, when you were not used to it, like genius. When she finished, the room took a full beat to remember how to applaud. Some people smiled, others scribbled notes as if a new variable had just been discovered. Chairman Yen adjusted his glasses and asked a practical question about pilot scale. Mr. Pierre calculated aloud, his voice now softer, the prospect of a marketable narrative, tangibly sweeter. But the moment did not close into a handshake. Not yet. There were questions about liability, intellectual property, and whether small workshops could meet projected demand without unwanted middlemen. There were stories about previous partnerships gone wrong. There were the soft, insinuating references to reputational risk that always attach themselves to unfamiliar methods. And there was Li Chunfang still present in the background, like a recall. Her influence had not faded. If anything, it posed a threat that had shifted shape. Not overt sabotage this time, but a whisper campaign. An attempt to make the consortium doubt the social stability of partnering with Lin's network. It was a new kind of weather. One that could drown a person in affordable doubts. When the meeting recessed, it recessed into questions, rather than answers. Lin stepped outside into late afternoon, and felt the sun like an honest light. The city hummed with the possibility of change, and the warning of caution. For now, the consortium had not signed. The trillion-dollar language lived in certain heads and headlines. But the real work was still ahead. She returned to the market with a list of things she needed. A pattern block adjusted for a small factory press, an extra spool of reinforced thread, a talk with an elder dyer, who could explain how to scale dye lots without losing the soul in the colors. The life of a maker is rarely linear. It is a braided rope of small tasks that, when tensioned just right, can support something larger. Director Chun greeted her with a nod that said he had seen the room and the way it had held her. "You did what you could," he said. "But they need to see more than a hand demonstration. They will want pilots. Guarantees. Numbers. We can give them pilots. We can gather the numbers. It will mean more work. Paid work that builds the case." Lin looked at the list Director Chun offered, and the faces of the women in her night class, and she felt both the thrill of possibility and the drag of risk. This road would not be simple. Pilots mean production runs. Production runs mean money up front. Money up front means promises and contracts that can be read like small wars. It meant stepping into rooms with people who had always had power, now asked for proof. It meant vulnerability on a new scale. Back at home, she took out the small journal where she kept notes, measurements, list of stitches, and the conditions where they worked best. She sketched a plan for a pilot that could be produced in small workshops. The math simplified and honest. 300 pieces in 3 months. A timeline for training. A cost per unit with contingencies. It was not glamorous, but it was a map. The next morning, she began assembling teams. She visited workshops with Director Chun, where overhead lights buzzed, and tables bore the scars of labor. She negotiated with elder dyers, who were suspicious of outsiders, and young machinists, who had read about global deals, and wanted to be part of something bigger. She taught her economical stitch to a dozen hands, watching their faces tighten in concentration, and then relax in a way that signaled understanding. Apprentices became the community that had once turned away began, slowly, to lean forward. At the same time, the consortium's committee continued to wade through assumptions and risk matrices. New players arrived, logistics firms, potential brand partners, and a legal team that kept a list of caveats. They wanted to ensure the deal could be scaled without too much fragility. In the margins of these discussions, Lin became a constant variable, sometimes praised, sometimes queried, but always present. Her life settled into a rhythm of small, high-stakes tasks. Teaching seems. In the morning, paperwork. In the afternoon, late nights sketching pattern corrections. Fei Yang learned to press collars. Yun Luo helped sort small pieces of trim into jars. A job he took seriously, delighted by the order of things. Their household was still thin on resources, but it was thicker with purpose than it had been a year before. And then another storm came. But this one looked like an opportunity dressed in shadow. A prominent designer who had been lobbying for the consortium made a public accusation that the work Lin proposed had an origin that would undermine the legal claim of certain rights, an assertion that was more bluster than law. But it carried weight. The consortium had to pause and investigate. The investigation asked for documentation, for provenance, for assurances. It asked Lin to produce a paper trail for a story that had been woven in kitchens and workshops where people kept memory more than receipts. She gathered what she could. Testimony from Director Chun. A sketchbook with dated pages. Photographs of workshops at different stages. She met with a lawyer who worked on small retainer, and listened as legal terms were translated into plain clauses. The lawyer told her plainly that the room of negotiations prefers certainty, and that uncertainty breeds indecision. You must be patient and persistent, the lawyer said. People will look for a reason to delay, give them less reason. Patience, however, does not always feel like strategy. It can feel like inertia. The consortium's pause spread like a mist over plans. Work had to continue, but it moved into a liminal space. The pilot could not begin until all questioned rights were clarified. The clock ticked. Li Chunfeng's campaign intensified, not with overt force, but with slow erosion. Murmured doubts, invitations retracted, a photo that misrepresented a workshop's condition. For a moment, it seemed like the smallest misrepresentations could topple the largest hopes. In the market, days passed with the same rhythm. And yet everything seemed edged with the need to prove. Lin taught stitching by day and, by night, organized schedules for potential pilot runs. She learned to speak corporate, and the corporate world learned, begrudgingly, to speak some craft. Director Chun coached her on preparing numbers that read like contracts. Make them see the margin, he said. Show the math as clearly as you show the stitch. Weeks of preparation culminated in a moment the community would remember as both small and monumental. The first pilot run. It was not a warehouse with polished floors, but a cluster of workshops, a dozen machines running in sunken rooms that smelled of oil and dye. Women bent over stitches, a rhythm like ocean swell. Children ran errands, and meals were shared among workers who were not yet partners in any legal sense but were collaborators all the same. When the first small batch came off the line, 300 garments, each with the signature economical seam, and a variation of color, born from different dye lots, there was a hush. They were plain and extraordinary at the same time, looking less like trophies, and more like the promise of livelihoods. Lin held one up, and felt the fabric like a living thing. It had passed a practical test. The seams held under stress, the hems did not fray, the pattern fit a range of body types. It was a success on the scale that mattered. There was, of course, no triumphant parade. There was instead a slow feeding of information into the consortium's committee. Test reports, production photos, affidavits from workshop heads, an accounting of costs. The legal team waded through terms and adjusted clauses. The consortium moved forward in increments, the way large things do. One cautious step, another, always measuring the ground. But just when the pilot seemed to be paving the way forward, a new complication arose, not from law or logistics but from people who feared losing their own influence. An advisor to a potential brand partner suggested a different direction, one that favored big manufacturers over the small workshops. An advisor to a potential brand partner had suggested a different direction, one that favored big manufacturers with glossy supply chains, with scale guaranteed by machines and middlemen who could promise delivery dates with the kind of confidence spreadsheets love. The moment the name of the advisor's favored partner entered the conversation, the negotiation began to drift toward the safe harbor of familiarity. The consortium's risk models tilted, and small workshops suddenly became a variable many wanted to minimize. It was a subtle shift at first. A request for more documentation, a demand for a third-party test, a careful suggestion that a pilot be moved to a certified site rather than a cluster of family-run rooms. Each ask was reasonable on its own. Together they formed a net that could entangle a woman whose memory of meetings revolved around the rhythm of a thimble, not the cadence of compliance checklists. Li Chunfeng tightened the net. She did not shout, she did not make headlines. She whispered, and her whispers had currency in the delicate economies of influence. She replicated old tactics in new clothes, on offhand remark to a brand manager about supply risk, a photo of a workshop that hinted at poor conditions, posted with a carefully ambiguous caption, a former acquaintance remembering something inconvenient. The campaign's tenor was practical, raise doubts, request more proof, slow the momentum. A new complication arrived with the weight of an industrial sample test. A quality assurance lab, hired by a skeptical partner, reported that a dye lot had failed a fast wash test. The color ran in the machine, marking the fabric like a bruise. The headlines in a few eager journals barely waited. Authenticity at risk? Consortium reconsiders. The committee paused negotiations. The Buyers' Council demanded a pause. The legal team recommended further documentation. The pilot's momentum sagged as red pens sharpened. Lin received the news in the middle of the night, when the market was a string of dim lights, and the city settled into an uneasy breath. Thayang and Yonlua slept next to each other. The room smelled of starch and laundry. Lin sat on the edge of the bed, the lab report heavy and clinical in her hands. She went through the chemistry and Hodgschmidt's terms as best she could. The words meant little to her. What she could grasp was that some wash had removed color where none should have been lost. It was not simply a technical issue. In the conversations she had heard at the consortium, it was shorthand for reputational risk. She called Director Chun before dawn. He answered quickly, not surprised that rumble had come to them. We will not let a bad report be the whole story, he said. We will run our own test. And he paused, the way a man with years of making things under pressure learned to speak with economy. We will show them again. Within 48 hours, a neighborhood of workshops hummed like a single organism. Lin watched dye vets, darker and richer than she had ever seen in large production briefs, and an elder dyer named Old Song stirred the color like a priest stirring broth. They traced the batch numbers, they ran tests. The same fast wash repeated and repeated until a pattern emerged. The labs in the market did not have fancy ISO certifications, but they had years of intuition and habits that would not be hurried. The result was telling. A mistake in the lab's protocol. The detergent used in the test had been a heavy industrial cleaner, intended for synthetic blends, not for the plant-dyed yarns Lin's workshops used. When the correct wash solution was applied, the fabric passed. The PR spin of the lab's initial failure dissolved like dye in water. But the damage had already been useful to Li Chunfang's campaign. A skeptical partner had paused, and an advisor who preferred scale to soul felt vindicated. That moment forced a new maneuver. Lin realized that showing the consortium a corrected lab report would not be enough. The room cared, rightly, about repeatability. This would be replicated by many hands under many conditions. She needed a demonstration that could not be dismissed as a correction or a fluke. The idea grew in her like a stubborn stitch. A live on-the-floor demonstration on honest production run in front of skeptical buyers. She proposed the demonstration to the consortium's operations team with the bluntness that had become her style. Bring them here, she said. Bring the buyers, bring their technical people. Show them the workshop, let them see the machines warm up, the dyers stir, the hands learn the stitch. Director Chun, who had organized many a feverish sample run, smiled at the audacity. Chairman Yan, who was cautious by temperament, but not immune to practical proof, agreed to visit, since seeing would, better than any contract, recalibrate assumptions. The day the consortium came to the workshops, the city was a thin slice of silver sunlight. The visitors arrived in cars with tinted windows, and the transition from glass towers to workroom felt abrupt to the executives. They stepped off into rooms where light fell through dust and where the air tasted like dye and oil, and the careful labor of people who had memorized the rhythm of a needle. They met the elder dyers, and the machine hands, and the women who had been Lin's students only months before. Lin walked them through the process with a simplicity that made complex things clear. She showed them the lay method that reduced offcuts, staggered pattern placement, mirrored pieces, the use of smaller filler motifs where waste usually collected. She demonstrated the technical seam in slow motion and then in real time, pulling a sample that had run through an accelerated wear test. The seam held. She introduced a QC protocol they had written in plain language. a checklist that any foreman could follow. A few simple tolerances. A single person assigned to cross-verify color. When a skeptical engineer asked about throughput, Lin turned to Director Chun and asked him to run a mini-batch on the factory floor. Machines took up the cadence. The consortium's own technical consultant, who had been skeptical in meetings, watched counters tick, and then stopped looking skeptical. The run delivered pieces that met the spec. The math turned into measured reality. Mr. Peer, who had once had a taste for spectacle, leaned against a table and smiled in a way that admitted approval. But proof in the room was a fragile victory. The same week of the demonstration, an anonymous blog published a post that asserted foreign licensing risk, that sellers in one of the consortium's target markets might not accept the variations that made the product authentic. The post included quotes from unnamed sources and images of stretched fabric, and it spread because ambiguity travels faster than the nuance of craft. The consortium wavered again. Somewhere in the machinery of big deals, fear sought new footholds. Li Chunfang's campaign adjusted. She seeded new talking points in the market about consumer preferences for standardized products. Her allies, people who had always preferred tidy profit margins, took those talking points and turned them into memos. Meetings multiplied, and the countdown to a final decision extended. If the matter were a river, Li's whispers were pebbles in the water that slowed the current. Lin felt the pressure as a physical weight. She could not control every narrative. She could control the work. So she did. She organized additional training sessions, wrote clear instructions, arranged for a visiting quality engineer from a trusted university to audit their process, and compiled the evidence into a folder that read less like a contract and more like a report from people who had grown expertise by doing. She met with buyers individually, and she answered questions, not with appeals to feeling, but with line items. Cost per unit, expected margin, training time, contingency margins, and still, the consortium hesitated. The negotiation, which had been warm with the possibility of partnership, turned judicial in tone. The investors wanted guarantees. The brands wanted indemnities. It was the kind of risk aversion that made Lin wonder whether the modern market had room for nuance. Days became a collage of small crises. A supplier requesting higher upfront payment, a logistics quote that doubled, a sudden censorship of a social post celebrating the pilot run. Each crisis required energy, calls, and careful explanation. In this tensile environment, the pressure on Lin's family doubled. The children sensed the stakes, and Fayang asked questions that were too large for his age. Will this mean you'll be gone more? Yanluo, who liked to sort trim, tried to measure worry by how many jars of buttons he could fill. And then, when the negotiation seemed poised over a knife, the consortium in one room, potential brand partners in another, the unthinkable happened. The lead negotiator left the table. A major buyer, one of the anchors who would have guaranteed market distribution, sent a private message that evening. Their board could not support the partnership unless an established manufacturer was part of the front-end delivery. In practical terms, that meant giving an established player access to production or control. People in the corridor began to map the consequences. The small workshops would risk being subsumed. Lin feared for the artisan's autonomy, even as she understood the buyer's need for assured supply. For the first time since she had begun sewing in the margins, Lin felt the kind of urgency that nudged her from preparation to action. She could not let the pilot become another polite footnote. She needed to show impressively, incontrovertibly, that small workshops could deliver at scale with quality. She proposed one final intervention. A live negotiation in the consortium's big hall, with all parties present, during which she would present, not a report, but a living prototype complete, with a logistic plan, a training schedule, and a financing model that preserved artisans' rights by offering equity shares in a cooperative. The cooperative was her idea. A small, member entity that allowed artisans to participate in profits and kept control of patterns and provenance. It would require the consortium to accept a new structure, but it also offered legitimacy and a safeguard for the communities she stood for. The proposal was audacious. Advisors muttered about risks. The legal team drew up clauses that took days to untangle. Chairman Yen, who had watched Lin's demonstrations and had seen the quiet power that came from honest work, intervened on her behalf. "We asked for a partner who would preserve heritage and provide scale," he said in a meeting. "This plan gives us both if it's done with rigor." The day of the final negotiation was the day the story would either be made or forget itself. The hall was the same one that had once held polite presentations and glossy renderings. Now it carried an edge quiet, tight, and watchful. The main table filled with buyers, lawyers, investors, and the expected contingent of consultants. Lin arrived with Director Chun and a small delegation. 3 workshop leaders, Old Song the Daya, and a young foreman named Mei who had learned the economical stitch 3 months ago, and who carried herself with a new steadiness. She placed the prototype on the table and opened her notebook. Her plan lay inside. Cost per unit, production timeline, QC markers, a membership agreement for the cooperative, and a revenue split that allocated funds for training, for shared machinery, and for a communal fund for emergencies. Her language was as plain as the stitches she loved. When the buyers expressed concern about supply reliability, Lin asked for a moment to show them something they had not yet seen. Mezzanine footage, recorded in the workshops during the pilot run, side by side with the pilot's QC data, the throughput logs, and the invoices for die lots. She played the footage and walked the room through it. Step by step, people watched machinists move with consistent rhythms. They watched Old Song measure die. They saw a production board where batch status updated in real time. There were no glossy filters on these images, only honesty. Then Lin did the thing the room had not expected. She asked to move the negotiation from the table to the floor. "Let us prove it here," she said. "Let us train one machine in your presence. Let Mei show the stitch, and then run a mini batch. If the product meets the metrics you need, then we move forward. If not, we accept the conditions you require for correction." It was an outrageous request, practical, humiliating for some, brave for others. The lead buyer hesitated and then, with a pragmatic shrug, agreed. They needed to see confidence translated into practice. The room moved like a flock to the demonstration area, watching as Mei, with Lin and Director Chun beside her, set up a single machine on a staging table. Mei's hands were steady. She sewed with a quiet focus, and the machine sang the familiar song of controlled speed. She stitched the economical seam as Lin had taught her, repeating it until the assembled piece matched the spec. The assembled item then went through a portable wash test, exactly the kind of test that had once failed under a wrong protocol. The fabric came out whole, the color true, the seam intact. It looked as it had in the pilot. The engineers counted the pieces and ran metrics. The numbers matched the claims Lin had put on paper. The room exhaled. Mr. Pierre, who had once leaned toward theatrics, turned to Chairman Yan and calculated possibilities aloud. "If this can be delivered across 1,000 units a month with controlled training modules, the story is marketable." He smiled. "Consumers want authenticity, and if we can meet margins, the narrative will push buyers." The lead buyer turned, still cautious, toward the consortium's council. "We need a commitment to the cooperative model," they said. "We will need a clause guaranteeing production milestones and a dispute resolution process. We will require an anchor manufacturer to back logistics for the first 6 months, just to ensure the supply chain." Lin heard that clause and felt the old animal in her princes of industry offering protection in exchange for control. She understood its logic. She also had leverage now. She had shown, in real time, that workshops could deliver, and that training translated into predictable output. She negotiated with the room, in the currency she knew best, clarity and evidence. She proposed a compromise that preserved artisans' rights, while giving the anchor manufacturer oversight, not ownership. The anchor would provide logistics and warehousing but take no proprietary claim over patterns or the cooperative's governance. The cooperative's members would have seats on a supervisory board. The legal team drafted terms on laptops across polished wood. Negotiations dragged toward evening. Every clause felt heavy, like a hem that required precise pinning before the final stitch. There were hard minutes where risk-averse voices tried to reclaim the easy option of contracting with a large manufacturer. There were other minutes when the cooperative's human stake women, who had learned to press collars, children who had watched their mothers build a new life, the room a gravity that spreadsheets could not simulate. And then, when language had been sharpened, when indemnities were written and countersigned on preliminary sheets, something decisive happened. The lead buyer, after a pause that held the room like a breath, closed their folder, looked straight at Lin, and said, "We will proceed. We will pilot under the cooperative model, with the anchor providing logistics for the first year. We expect regular audits, production, milestones, and a marketing plan that accurately represents provenance. If these conditions are met, we will begin rollout in selected markets next quarter. We will sign." The tables shifted into motion. Hands reached for pens. Director Chun's eyes met Lin's, and held a quiet, almost private approval. Mr. Pierre rose, and, with a slight theatrical flourish that made a few people smile, declared that this kind of integrated story was exactly the brand experience their clients had been craving. Chairman Yen, who had watched the room balance on the edge of risk and possibility, allowed himself a small nod of relief. Lin Xiulan was in the crowd. Her face, which had once held a smirk that made 100 people uneasy, now displayed the pale calm of someone whose scheme had not broken as loudly as she had hoped but had not succeeded either. Partners began to cluster away. People who had lent their ears to her murmurs now found themselves aligning with the document on the table. The market of influence had shifted. The whisper had lost traction. It was not dramatic. It was practical. Allies changed positions in the same way they would change suppliers if price and quality demanded it. When the signing happened, a preliminary memorandum of understanding that set the pilot into motion. Cameras were not yet rolling, but a few phones captured the moment. Reporters would later call it a turning point, and some outlets would mouth the clickbait of trillion-dollar vision. Internally, the consortium would call it a well-structured pilot with a path to scale. Either description felt true in its way. For Lin, the moment was quieter. She felt a deep fatigue, an unclenching she had not noticed she'd been holding for months. Offers followed. One anchor manufacturer suggested a consultancy role for Lin to oversee training. Another investor proposed seed capital for the cooperative's first set of shared machinery. Chairman Yan suggested an advisory seat on the consortium's cultural steering panel. Each proposition was tempting, and each carried its own set of expectations. Lin considered them with the care of someone who had learned that promises could be thin cloth. What she wanted, what the workshops needed, was independence. They needed boots-on-the-ground training, a legal form that protected rights, and working capital that did not demand control. She negotiated interests with her own combination of bluntness and practicality. She accepted a limited consultancy role to oversee the training and quality for the pilot, enough to ensure fidelity to the method, and she insisted on co-ownership of the cooperative's governance. She accepted seed funding structured as a low-interest loan to buy shared machines. The loan would be repaid by revenues and supplemented by a reinvestment clause that kept profits flowing back into the cooperative for at least 3 years. The anchor manufacturer would be a partner in logistics, not an owner of rights. In the aftermath, with documents signed and conditions agreed, there was a softer, tender negotiation in another sphere. family. Zhang Qiushen came to the market that evening with a small bouquet of peat flowers. Clumsy, like someone practicing grace. He did not enter with grand words. He said, "I heard about the signing." He asked about the kids, about the workshops, about the cooperative. His voice was uneven in a way that suggested the reckoning he had with his own choices. Lin listened with a deliberate calm. "You had some choices to make," she said. "This work does not need rescuing, Qiusheng. It needs support. It needs proper partners. My children need a steady life." She set a boundary. She would accept help in practical forms, childcare. On certain nights, shared expenses and clear measures, but she would not accept being placed again in a role that implied she could not steer her own ship. He nodded. He left with a humility that felt earned, not imposed. In the months that followed, his attempts at repair were small and steady. He paid for a week of childcare when Lin had to travel. He visited the children sometimes, and he never asked to be lauded for these acts. That humility threaded into a tentative, practical co-parenting arrangement that preserved Lin's central authority. Li Chunfeng's consequences arrived in practical rather than theatrical forms. Clients who had sought distance from controversy withdrew the small favors they had extended her. An agency that did her PR quietly folded a contract. A local buyer who had once smiled across a table at her left when Lin worked. The market suddenly found no value in the campaign of whispers she had built. There was no public spectacle of disgrace, only the slower erosion of influence. The market tends to remember who supplied value. Those who survive by undermining others often find the well of allies runs dry when the community sees utility in a different direction. As the pilot rolled out, life at Lin's house changed in ways that were quiet and profound. Fei Yang began to learn the basics of production planning on a small tablet. Director Chun left numbers that matched the orders the cooperative was receiving. Yunlua, who liked to sort threads, became the union of color. He learned to catalog shades and to identify dye lots. The children's school fees were met, not by sudden wealth, but by a steady trickle of income from training sessions and small sample commissions. Lin's nights were still long, but the long evenings carried different music, now a chorus of sewing machines that hummed, not in fear, but in hope. Director Chun's role shifted too. He took pride in the cooperative's early successes and pursued a formal role as operations advisor. He helped secure loan terms and mediated with the anchor for warehousing schedules. He watched as the workshops completed their first larger run and as the cooperative's members watched their own names attached to invoices and packaging slips. For a man who loved making things work, the satisfaction was both technical and human. There were citizens who noticed. The market became, incrementally, a small hub for a larger movement. Young women who had not previously thought handcraft could be a career began to learn sewing properly. Elders returned to supervise dyeing with dignity. The cooperative's first batch entered market trials in a coastal city and sold at a respectable pace, enough to validate the model and to provide the cooperative with its first real profit to reap. Months later, at a modest celebration that felt like both a company meeting and a family dinner, Lin stood and watched as the cooperative's board, comprised of 3 workshop leaders, herself, Director Chun, as advisor, and 2 elected artisan members, approved a reinvestment into a small shared dye laboratory that would standardize color in ways that preserved handcraft. The vote was unanimous. Applause in that room had a different timbre than the applause in halls of glossy renderings. It was gratitude folded with pride. News outlets that had once used the hyperbolic trillion-dollar phrase now wrote more measured pieces about sustainable partnerships and ethical scaling. The language shifted from sensational to substantive, and in the pieces that mattered most, local papers, trade journals, artisan blogs, people spoke of livelihoods preserved, of skills passed on, of markets that finally asked art to meet industry, rather than industry swallowing art whole. One morning, As autumn pressed the air into a thin clarity, Lin walked through the cooperative's newest room. Machines hummed, apprentices leaned over boards, and May, now promoted to trainer, corrected a seam with a patient hand. Old song. The dyer showed a young person how to test the color. Children of workshop members ran small errands, their laughter threading through the hum like a needle. Fei Yang, who had started taking small logistics courses, waved a printout of an inventory system he'd begun to understand. Yunluo polished buttons, proud of a job that allowed him to be useful. A reporter asked Lin about the moment when she had burst into a room and turned the tide. She could have described the sharpness of the boardroom, the drama of being underestimated. Instead, she spoke about the everyday things, the nights of mending, the economies learned at a kitchen table, the way a stitch becomes a decision. The thing that mattered, she said, was not that I burst into a room, it was that I had sewn a case so clearly that people could see its seams. That's what made them trust it, and I had people beside me who believed we could build and that the work of many hands should remain with many hands. The cooperative continued to grow. Lin accepted a consulting role with the consortium for the pilot's first year, a paid advisory seat that allowed her to oversee training standards. She also retained equity in the cooperative, and a voice on its governance board. It was not a rescue, it was a structure for sustained work. Li Chunfang faded from the center of things, not as a spectacle, but as influence evaporating when practical value shifted elsewhere. She took other contracts, and in small market corners the memory of her whispers remained only as a cautionary tale about building power on the erosion of others. There were victories that never made the business pages. A foreman who had once been underpaid received a formal contract with proper benefits. A woman who had never left her village in a decade took a bus to a distant city to lead a training session. A child who used to set an extra place at the table no longer measured hunger as a permanent state. These wins were granular and multiplied daily. In the months after the pilot, the cooperative's model attracted the attention of other regions. Delegations came to observe, to learn how to set up similar structures that preserved artisan rights. Lin traveled occasionally. Speaking a language, she had to learn the language of contracts and, translating it back into the language of the shop floor, she taught not with grand pronouncements, but with patience, and with examples. How to mark a pattern to reduce waste, how to negotiate a fair price, how to make the stitch that binds both cloth and community. One quiet evening, after a full day at the cooperative, Lin sat on the stoop of her market home, and looked at the children as they drew chalk figures on the pavement. A neighbor passed by with a steaming bowl of soup, and they exchanged the kind of small kindnesses that had once been the currency of survival. She felt the residue of months of pressure relax into something close to contentedness, not triumph as an end, but the steady motion of a life that had found rhythm again. Someone would, later, write a headline much like the one that had first grabbed attention. No designer could seal the $1 trillion deal until a single mom burst in. It made for good clickbait. It made for a tidy narrative for readers who liked their stories in tense frames. But the truth, the messy and important truth, was less sensational and more durable. The deal had been sealed because someone translated craft into scale without surrendering the people who made the craft. Lin had not burst in to be saved. She had entered to be seen, and to make sure the view did not swallow the people behind it. The cooperative continued. The pilot became a year-long program. Orders stabilized. The Anka manufacturer fulfilled logistic duties, and the small rooms in the market turned their work into predictable livelihoods. Apprenticeship programs formalized. Young women who had thought their hands were for mending now learned to design. Old Song taught teenagers the alchemy of color. May, who had once been a trainee, lectured on quality control. At home, the children slept well. Fei Yang began to believe in futures that included school trips and small savings. Yan Luo collected buttons with a professional pride. Zhang Qiaisheng and Lin exchanged once a month a message about school fees and nothing more. There was no grand reconciliation, but there was a practical arrangement that respected the lives they each had chosen. The last scene was small. Lin stood in the cooperative's newest classroom, holding a needle between 2 fingers. Around her sat 10 students, faces intent. She demonstrated a stitch economical, strong, beautiful in its way, and they followed. The room smelled of warmed fabric and possibilities. When they finished, someone asked what she would do next. She answered with the voice of a woman who had learned both to ask for things and to hold them with care. "We keep teaching," she said. "We build the work so it lasts. We make sure the people who make the work have the right to say how it's made." Outside, the market continued in the small ways that hold a city together. Inside, the cooperative hummed. The deal that many would later call transformative had been sealed not by pedigree or polished slides, but by hands that knew scarcity and turned it into resilient. No single person saved them. Lin's skill, persistence, and insistence on dignity for makers braided together with the work of colleagues and the belief of a few decision makers, until the room that had once said no found a reason to say yes. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that craft, courage, and clear-eyed negotiation can change not just contracts, but lives.